Are those medals real, or did you buy them online? The question echoed across the quiet courtroom with a tone that made a few people chuckle under their breath. And for a moment, I simply stood there, feeling every pair of eyes settle on the small row of worn ribbons and metal resting against my jacket. My name is Jack Mercer, and at 78 years old, I have learned that silence can sometimes carry more weight than any argument ever could. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood polish and paper, the kind of smell that lingers in buildings that have seen decades of quiet decisions and forgotten stories. Judge William Carter leaned forward from his high bench, fingers steepled, studying me as if he had already decided exactly what kind of man I was. To him, I probably looked like any other aging veteran who had wandered into a courthouse wearing something he hadn't earned. My jacket was old, the navy wool slightly faded at the elbows, and my shoes had the soft creases that come from years of careful use. I could hear a chair creak somewhere behind me and the quiet rustle of someone shifting in their seat, the way people do when they think they're about to witness something embarrassing. Mr. Mercer, the judge said again, slower this time, his voice edged with thin patience. Those decorations look impressive, but this court takes fraud seriously. I would recommend removing them before we go any further. I didn't move. The medals rested exactly where they had rested for many years, catching a thin bar of afternoon sunlight coming through the tall courthouse windows. That light made the edges of the metal glow softly, the same way they had glowed in a completely different place a long time ago. For a brief moment, my mind drifted to the day they were placed in my hands, to the quiet voice of an officer who had spoken words I never expected to hear. But the memory faded quickly as the judge cleared his throat. "Did you hear me, Mr. Mercer?" he asked, leaning forward slightly as if trying to push the words across the room. I lifted my eyes and met his gaze, calm and steady. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. "I heard you." A few people in the gallery leaned forward, waiting for the next line. The way people wait for a punchline. The judge tilted his head and gave a small skeptical smile. "Then you understand my concern," he continued. "These kinds of medals are sometimes replicated." The word hung there carefully chosen. I could feel the attention in the room tightening, curiosity building like pressure in a sealed container. A clerk at a side desk paused in the middle of writing something, her pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. Somewhere behind me a man coughed softly. I rested my hands at my sides and looked down briefly at the small row of metal and ribbon. They were not polished the way museum pieces are polished. Time had softened them, rounded their edges, dulled their shine. They looked ordinary. That was the funny thing about objects that carry history. They rarely look like anything special. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair now, folding his arms. "Well," he asked, "are you planning to remove them, Mr. Mercer?" I took a slow breath and lifted my head again. My voice stayed steady when I answered. "No, Your Honor," I said. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument ever could have been. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "No," he repeated. I shook my head once. "These medals never come off." For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to pause as if the air itself had stopped moving. The clerk at the desk blinked and looked more closely at the decorations across my chest. The judge's expression shifted from mild amusement to open irritation. "Mr. Mercer," he said slowly, "this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics." I simply stood there, hands still, shoulders relaxed, the way I had learned to stand many years ago when patience mattered more than pride. Around the room, the spectators waited to see how the old man in the worn jacket would explain himself, and none of them noticed the young clerk quietly leaning forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked more carefully at the faded ribbon at the center of my medals. I could feel the attention in the courtroom shift slightly after I said the medals never come off, the kind of shift that happens when people realize a moment is no longer routine, but something else entirely. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, studying me the way a man studies a puzzle that should have been simple, but suddenly was not. The room itself was quiet enough that I could hear the soft ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind the benches, each second stretching longer than the last. The clerk at the side desk, the young woman who had been writing earlier, had stopped completely now. Her pen rested against the paper while her eyes stayed fixed on the small row of ribbons across my chest. I had seen that look before. It was the look of someone trying to remember where they had seen something before. Judge Carter cleared his throat again and straightened his robe with a small, impatient tug. "Mr. Mercer," he said, speaking slowly as though explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. This court operates under rules and procedures. If you insist on wearing decorations that cannot be verified, then you place this court in a difficult position. I did not respond right away. Instead, I glanced briefly toward the tall windows along the side of the courtroom where late afternoon light streamed across the polished floor. Dust drifted through the beam of sunlight in slow, lazy spirals. It reminded me of quiet mornings many years ago when the world felt much larger and time moved differently. But that memory stayed in the back of my mind because the present moment demanded patience. Your Honor, I finally said, my voice calm and steady. I am not placing anyone in a difficult position. A faint murmur moved through the gallery, quickly silenced when the bailiff shifted his stance near the door. Judge Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then perhaps you would like to explain why you believe courtroom protocol does not apply to you, he replied. His tone had lost its earlier amusement. Now there was a trace of irritation, the kind that comes when authority is questioned in a room designed to reinforce it. I shook my head gently. Protocol applies to everyone, I said, including me. That answer seemed to confuse him more than defiance would have. He leaned forward again, fingers resting on the polished wood of the bench. And yet you refuse a direct request from the court. I held his gaze for a moment before speaking again. I refused to remove them. The silence returned, heavier this time. Somewhere behind me a chair shifted as someone leaned forward to see better. Judge Carter exhaled, slowly through his nose, and turned his attention briefly toward the bailiff, as if considering the next step in a process he had performed many times before. But before he could speak again, a soft voice came from the clerk's desk. Your Honor, the young woman said cautiously. Every head in the room turned toward her. She hesitated as though suddenly aware that she had interrupted something important. Yes, Ms. Rhodes, the judge replied, a hint of impatience entering his voice again. Emily Rhodes glanced down at the legal pad in front of her and then back at me. Her eyes moved once more to the ribbon in the center of the medals, the pale blue fabric catching the light just enough to draw attention if someone knew what they were looking for. I might be mistaken, she said carefully, but that decoration appears to be a Congressional Medal of Honor ribbon. The words seemed to hang in the air like a bell that had just been struck. Judge Carter frowned. Appearances can be deceiving, Ms. Rhodes, he said quickly. Replicas exist. She nodded slowly, though her expression did not change. Yes, Your Honor, they do. Her eyes returned to the medals again, studying the small details most people in the room would never notice. The tiny arrangement of stars woven into the ribbon, the specific shade of blue, the subtle wear along the edge that only time could create. I remained standing quietly while the weight of that observation settled over the courtroom. I had learned long ago that truth rarely needs to raise its voice. It simply waits for the right moment to be recognized. I remained standing where I was while the quiet observation from Emily Rhodes settled across the courtroom like a ripple spreading through still water, and for a moment nobody spoke because everyone in that room understood the weight of the words Congressional Medal of Honor even if they did not fully grasp what it meant to see that ribbon in person. Judge Carter leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression tightening as if he had just been presented with a complication he did not appreciate. The courtroom clock ticked again somewhere behind the benches, and the faint sound seemed louder than before. The judge looked from Emily Rhodes back to me, then down toward the medals resting against my jacket. His eyes lingered on the pale blue ribbon for only a second before his jaw tightened. Ms. Rhodes, he said carefully, as I stated a moment ago, appearances can be misleading. His voice carried the firm tone of someone accustomed to being the final authority in the room. Emily Rhodes did not argue. She simply nodded once, though the thoughtful look in her eyes remained. I could see that she was still studying the ribbon, noticing the quiet details that most people never notice. The specific shade of blue that never quite matches replicas. The pattern of stars woven carefully into the fabric. The faint crease where the ribbon had rested against a uniform many years ago. Judge Carter exhaled through his nose and shifted forward again, placing both hands on the polished wood of the bench as if reclaiming control of the moment. Mr. Mercer, he said, his tone now edged with impatience rather than humor. This discussion is becoming unnecessarily complicated. I met his gaze calmly. It does not have to be complicated, Your Honor, I replied. A faint murmur moved through the courtroom again, quickly silenced when the bailiff adjusted his stance near the door. The judge narrowed his eyes slightly. Then help the court understand why you insist on wearing decorations that cannot be verified in this setting, he said. I glanced down at the small row of medals across my chest. They did not shine brightly under the courtroom lights. Time had softened them, dulling their surfaces the way years soften almost everything. But to me they still carried the quiet weight of the day they were placed there. They can be verified, I said simply. The judge lifted one eyebrow. Then perhaps you would like to provide documentation, he replied. I shook my head once. I do not carry documentation for them. The answer clearly frustrated him. Mr. Mercer, that is precisely the problem, he said. Without verification, this court has no reason to assume these decorations are legitimate. Behind me someone shifted again in their seat. The tension in the room had begun to build slowly, like the quiet pressure before a storm that has not yet decided whether it will arrive. Emily Rhodes glanced from the judge back to me, her brow slightly furrowed, as if a memory was forming just out of reach. Your Honor, she said cautiously again. Judge Carter did not look pleased to be interrupted a second time. Yes, Ms. Rhodes. She hesitated before speaking. If that ribbon is authentic, then there would only be a limited number of individuals who could wear it. The judge waved a dismissive hand. That is exactly my point, he replied quickly. Which makes it far more likely that we are looking at a replica. I said nothing. Silence has a way of allowing people to reveal more about themselves than any argument ever could. The judge leaned back again, folding his arms across his chest. Mr. Mercer, I will ask you one final time, he said, his voice firm now. Remove the medals, or the court will be forced to treat them as unauthorized decorations. I lifted my eyes toward him again. The late afternoon light from the windows stretched across the floor between us. Your Honor, I said quietly. Those medals represent promises that were made a long time ago. The judge frowned slightly, clearly unimpressed. Promises do not override courtroom procedure, he replied. I nodded slowly. No, they do not, I said. The silence that followed stretched longer than the others had. In that moment the young clerk at the desk quietly reached toward her computer keyboard, her eyes still fixed on the ribbon across my chest, as if she had finally remembered exactly where she had seen it before. Emily Rhodes reached for the keyboard slowly, almost cautiously, as if she did not want the quiet sound of the keys to disturb the fragile balance that had formed inside the courtroom. I watched the movement from the corner of my eye, while keeping my posture relaxed, my hands resting loosely at my sides the same way they had rested for decades whenever patience mattered more than pride. The faint tapping of the keys began, soft and careful, the sound nearly swallowed by the stillness in the room. Judge Carter noticed it almost immediately. His eyes shifted toward the clerk's desk, and his expression tightened with visible irritation. Ms. Rhodes, he said sharply. The court is currently addressing Mr. Mercer. Emily paused for a moment, but did not fully stop. She looked up respectfully. Yes, Your Honor, she replied. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet determination behind it now. I simply wanted to confirm something. The judge leaned back slightly, clearly displeased that his authority had once again been interrupted by quiet curiosity. Confirm what exactly, he asked. Emily hesitated for a brief moment as the computer screen illuminated her face with a pale glow. Her eyes moved across the screen quickly, scanning lines of information that only she could see. I could hear the faint hum of the old courthouse computer tower beneath her desk. It reminded me of the low mechanical hum of equipment in places far away from courtrooms and polished wooden benches. The judge waited, drumming his fingers once against the bench. Well, he pressed. Emily took a slow breath. Your Honor, I was simply verifying the visual characteristics of the Medal of Honor ribbon. A faint ripple moved through the spectators again. Judge Carter frowned. Ms. Rhodes, that is unnecessary. As I have already stated, replicas exist. Emily nodded once more. Yes, Your Honor. They do, she said quietly. Her eyes lifted from the screen toward me again, then back to the ribbon across my chest. However, authentic ribbons have several identifying features that are rarely replicated correctly. The judge's expression hardened slightly, the way a person's expression changes when patience begins to run thin. And have you concluded your analysis, Ms. Rhodes? He asked. The room had grown so quiet that I could hear someone near the back inhale slowly, as if preparing to witness an argument that had not yet started. Emily looked down at the screen again. Her fingers moved carefully across the keyboard once more, pulling up a database entry that was not intended for courtroom curiosity, but existed nonetheless in the quiet corners of government records. The glow of the monitor reflected faintly in her glasses. "Your Honor," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "If the ribbon Mr. Mercer is wearing is authentic, then it would correspond to a specific record in the national database." Judge Carter shook his head with visible impatience. "Ms. Rhodes, this court is not conducting a military records search," he replied. "We are addressing a matter of courtroom procedure." I remained silent. Silence allows people to reveal far more than any response ever could. Emily looked toward the judge again. "Yes, Your Honor," she said respectfully. "But the ribbon alone may already answer the question." The judge folded his arms across his chest again. "Explain," he said. Emily turned slightly in her chair, glancing once more at the row of decorations across. "My jacket." Her eyes focused on the pale blue ribbon at the center. "The arrangement of stars on that ribbon," she said carefully, "matches the official pattern used by the Department of Defense. The wear along the fabric also suggests it has been mounted for a long period of time rather than recently purchased." A low murmur moved through the gallery again before fading into silence. Judge Carter did not look pleased. "Observation is not verification," he said firmly. Emily nodded again, but this time she did not immediately look away. "That is correct, Your Honor," she replied, "which is why I accessed the Service Recognition Registry." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You accessed what?" Emily glanced down at the screen again, then slowly back toward me. The faint hum of the courthouse computer filled the room as the information loaded. "The registry contains the names of every living recipient," she said quietly. The judge leaned forward slightly. "And?" Emily's eyes moved from the screen to the name written on the case file in front of her. Her voice remained calm when she spoke the next sentence. "Your Honor, according to the registry, there is only one Jack Mercer who matches the ribbon currently displayed in this courtroom." The silence that followed was deeper than anything that had come before it. And for the first time since the hearing began, Judge Carter's confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The silence that followed Emily Rhodes's words felt heavier than anything that had come before it, as if the entire courtroom had suddenly realized the moment was no longer ordinary. I stood exactly where I had been standing since the hearing began, hands relaxed at my sides, while every pair of eyes slowly turned back toward me. Judge Carter remained leaning forward behind the bench, but the confidence in his posture had shifted. It was subtle, the kind of change most people would never notice, but I had spent a lifetime learning to recognize small changes in a room. "Ms. Rhodes," the judge said carefully, his voice quieter now, "are you suggesting that the defendant standing in this courtroom is listed in a National Registry of Medal of Honor recipients?" Emily glanced once more at the screen in front of her. The soft glow of the monitor illuminated the seriousness in her expression. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "That is exactly what the registry indicates." A faint whisper moved through the gallery again before fading quickly into silence. The judge exhaled slowly through his nose, clearly trying to regain control of the moment. "A name match alone is not proof," he said. "Names can be duplicated." Emily nodded respectfully. "That is correct, Your Honor. However, the registry also lists the recipient's age, branch of service, and hometown." Her eyes shifted briefly toward the case file in front of her. Those details matched the information provided in Mr. Mercer's court record. The judge did not respond immediately. His gaze moved toward the medals on my jacket again, lingering longer this time. The late afternoon sunlight from the tall windows continued to stretch across the polished floor between us, casting long, quiet shadows that seemed to make the room feel even larger. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said finally, his voice measured now, "why did you not simply explain this earlier?" I looked at him calmly. "You did not ask, Your Honor," I replied. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats again, though nobody spoke. The judge pressed his lips together briefly, as if deciding whether to pursue the question further. "If the registry is correct," he said slowly, "then there would be additional documentation available through military channels." Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He leaned back in his chair again, folding his hands together thoughtfully. The room waited. I had seen rooms wait like this before, when people realized something larger than their expectations had just entered the conversation. Judge Carter finally looked toward the bailiff near the door. "This court will take a brief pause," he announced. The bailiff nodded once. But before the judge could rise from his chair, Emily spoke again. "Your Honor," she said carefully. The judge closed his eyes for a brief second before looking back toward her. "Yes, Ms. Rhodes." Emily hesitated only long enough to choose her words. "The registry entry also lists the officer who presented the medal during the ceremony." The judge frowned slightly. "And that is relevant because—" Emily glanced down at the screen once more. The soft glow reflected in her glasses as she read the final line. "Because that officer is still an active 4-star general." A deeper silence settled across the courtroom. The judge's posture stiffened slightly. "Active," he repeated. Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge tapped one finger once against the bench, thinking, "And this general would still have access to official confirmation of the award?" Emily answered quietly, "Yes." The judge's gaze slowly moved back toward me again. For the first time since the hearing began, the faint trace of uncertainty appeared in his expression. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "do you know this general personally?" I looked at the worn ribbon resting against my jacket. The memory of the day it was placed there returned briefly, clear as the sunlight in the courtroom window. "Yes," I said quietly. The judge leaned forward again. "And if the court were to request confirmation from that officer?" I met his gaze steadily. "He would remember," I replied. Somewhere behind the courtroom doors, footsteps echoed faintly down the long courthouse hallway, though none of us yet realized how soon that quiet answer was about to change the entire room. The faint echo of footsteps in the courthouse hallway grew slightly louder, slow and measured, though inside the courtroom no one had yet moved. Judge Carter remained seated behind the bench, his fingers lightly touching the polished wood as if he were considering how a routine hearing had suddenly shifted into unfamiliar territory. I remained where I stood, the weight of the room resting quietly around me. The sunlight from the tall windows had moved slightly across the floor now, stretching closer toward the center aisle, and the dust in the beam drifted slowly like tiny sparks suspended in the air. Emily Rhodes kept her eyes on the computer screen in front of her, but I could see that she was listening to the quiet sounds outside the courtroom door just as everyone else was beginning to notice them. Judge Carter cleared his throat and straightened slightly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone more controlled than before, "the court does not normally contact active duty officers to resolve procedural matters." I nodded once. "I understand that, Your Honor," I replied calmly. The judge studied me for a moment longer. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had faded into something more cautious. "Nevertheless," he continued, "if the information Ms. Rhodes has found is accurate, then verification would not be difficult." I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most honest answer a person can give. Behind me, someone in the gallery shifted quietly in their seat. The faint whisper of clothing against the wooden bench sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. Judge Carter turned slightly toward Emily Rhodes again. "Ms. Rhodes, the registry entry you located," he said, "does it identify the presenting officer clearly?" Emily glanced at the screen again. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge raised one eyebrow. "Name?" Emily took a slow breath before reading from the monitor. "General Daniel Hayes." The name settled into the room with quiet weight. A few people in the gallery exchanged brief glances, though most simply remained still. Judge Carter leaned back slightly. "General Hayes," he repeated. "That is a currently serving 4-star officer." Emily nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's expression shifted again, subtle but noticeable. A moment earlier the name had been only an abstract detail. Now it carried real presence. The judge tapped one finger lightly against the bench as if thinking through a problem that had grown larger than expected. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "when did you last speak with General Hayes?" I considered the question for a moment before answering. "Several years ago," I said, "at a memorial service." The judge studied my face as though trying to determine whether I was exaggerating or simply stating a fact. "And you believe he would remember you?" I glanced briefly at the worn ribbon resting on my jacket before meeting the judge's eyes again. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. The footsteps in the hallway outside grew louder now, no longer distant, but approaching steadily along the polished courthouse floor beyond the door. Emily Rhodes noticed it at the same moment I did. Her eyes lifted from the computer screen toward the courtroom entrance. The bailiff near the door shifted his stance slightly, turning his head toward the hallway as well. Judge Carter followed their attention and frowned faintly. "Is there another proceeding scheduled?" he asked. The bailiff shook his head once. "No, Your Honor." The sound of the approaching footsteps slowed just outside the door, followed by a quiet murmur of voices too distant to fully understand. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Carter glanced toward the door once more before returning his gaze to me. "Regardless," he said firmly, reclaiming his tone of authority, "this court will require formal verification before drawing conclusions." I nodded slightly. "That is reasonable, Your Honor." The judge opened his mouth as if to continue, but before he could speak the bailiff straightened abruptly, his posture changing in a way that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the room. The courtroom door opened slowly, and the late afternoon light from the hallway spilled across the threshold as a tall uniformed officer stepped quietly inside. The moment the door opened, the entire courtroom seemed to shift its attention at once, the quiet curiosity of the spectators turning into something sharper as the tall officer stepped inside with calm, measured steps. Sunlight from the hallway framed his silhouette for a second before the door slowly closed behind him, and the soft click of the latch echoed across the silent room. The officer wore a dark dress uniform pressed so sharply it seemed to hold the shape of discipline itself, the polished brass catching the fading afternoon light from the tall windows. The bailiff near the entrance straightened instinctively, his posture tightening, as if responding to a presence he recognized immediately even before a word had been spoken. Judge Carter leaned slightly forward behind the bench, his eyes narrowing as he studied the unfamiliar figure now standing just inside the courtroom. "This is a private proceeding," the judge began firmly, his voice returning to the tone of authority he had been trying to reclaim. The officer did not interrupt. Instead, he paused just long enough to remove a pair of dark gloves from his hand and tuck them neatly beneath his arm before continuing toward the center aisle. The quiet sound of his shoes crossing the polished floor carried through the room with steady rhythm. Every person in the gallery turned to watch him. Emily Rhodes had slowly risen from her chair at the clerk's desk without even realizing she had done so. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the insignia on the officer's shoulders. Judge Carter followed her gaze and then looked again at the approaching figure. The officer stopped halfway down the aisle, his posture straight but calm, and then turned his attention toward the bench. For a moment, neither man spoke. The judge seemed to be weighing the interruption against the unusual tension already hanging in the air. "Sir," Judge Carter said finally, "this courtroom is currently in session." The officer nodded once, respectful but unhurried. His voice when he answered was steady and clear. "I am aware of that, Your Honor." The room grew even quieter at the sound of the voice, the calm authority behind it unmistakable. The officer's eyes moved briefly across the courtroom until they reached the place where I stood near the center of the floor. When his gaze settled on me, something changed in his expression that only a few people in the room seemed to notice. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Emily Rhodes inhaled softly. The insignia on the officer's uniform had become impossible to ignore now. For silver stars rested across his shoulders, each one catching the light like a small signal to anyone who understood their meaning. Judge Carter noticed them a moment later, and the shift in his posture was immediate. The judge straightened in his chair. "General," he said slowly, the title leaving his mouth with careful respect now. The officer inclined his head slightly. "General Daniel Hayes," he replied calmly. The name settled across the courtroom like the final piece of a puzzle no one had expected to complete today. I watched the judge's expression carefully. A few minutes earlier the name had been theoretical, a detail in a database entry. Now the man himself stood quietly inside the courtroom. Judge Carter cleared his throat. "General Hayes," he said, regaining a measure of composure. "This is an unusual circumstance." The general's gaze shifted briefly toward the medals on my jacket before returning to the bench. "Yes, Your Honor," he said simply. The judge gestured lightly toward the center of the room. "May I ask what brings a 4-star general into a local courtroom during a civil hearing?" General Hayes glanced toward me again. His eyes softened in a way that carried decades of memory behind it. Then he looked back toward the judge. "I received a phone call a few minutes ago," he said calmly. The courtroom remained silent. The judge folded his hands together again. "From whom?" he asked. The general nodded slightly toward the clerk's desk. Emily Rhodes looked startled to realize the attention had shifted toward her, but she did not speak. General Hayes returned his gaze to the bench. From someone who thought this court might appreciate clarification about a particular decoration. The judge's eyes slowly moved from the general to the row of medals resting against my jacket. The room held its breath as General Hayes took one final step forward and spoke again, his voice steady and unmistakably certain. "Your Honor," he said, "the man standing in front of you did not fabricate those medals." The words from General Hayes settled across the courtroom with a quiet certainty that no one seemed willing to interrupt. And for several long seconds the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant ticking of the courthouse clock. Judge Carter remained very still behind the bench, his eyes moving slowly from the 4 silver stars resting on the general's shoulders to the worn ribbon and medals on my jacket. The confidence that had filled the courtroom earlier had completely changed shape now. It had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something more careful, more aware of the weight standing quietly in the center of the room. General Hayes took another slow step forward along the aisle until he stood only a few feet from where I remained standing. The polished floor reflected the faint outline of his uniform and the late afternoon sunlight, now stretching further across the room. The general stopped beside me and turned his attention toward the bench again. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "those medals were presented under my command many years ago." The words carried through the courtroom without force, yet every person present heard them clearly. Judge Carter straightened in his chair and folded his hands together in front of him as though resetting the tone of the proceeding. "General Hayes," he said carefully, "this court was attempting to verify certain claims made by Mr. Mercer." The general nodded once, his posture relaxed but unmistakably authoritative. "And that verification has now been provided," he replied. Emily Rhodes remained standing at the clerk's desk, her eyes moving between the general and the medals on my jacket, as if the scene unfolding in front of her still felt slightly unreal. The spectators in the gallery had grown completely silent now, their earlier curiosity replaced by a quiet awareness that they were witnessing something unexpected. Judge Carter cleared his throat again. "General Hayes," he said, "may I ask the nature of your connection to Mr. Mercer?" The general turned slightly and looked at me for a brief moment. His expression softened in a way that suggested decades of memory behind it. Then he faced the bench again. "Jack Mercer served under my command when I was a young officer," he said. The judge listened closely. The general continued in the same calm voice. "At that time I was responsible for recommending individuals whose actions represented the highest level of service and dedication." His gaze shifted briefly to the ribbon on my jacket. Mr. Mercer was one of those individuals. The room seemed to absorb those words slowly. Judge Carter nodded once, acknowledging the explanation. "So you personally approve the award?" he asked. General Hayes gave a small shake of his head. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I did not approve it." The judge looked slightly confused by the answer. "Then who did?" he asked. The general's voice remained steady. "The President of the United States," he replied. A faint intake of breath moved through the gallery before fading again into silence. Judge Carter lowered his eyes briefly toward the bench as if reconsidering the direction the hearing had taken. When he looked up again, the irritation that had once filled his expression had been replaced by a measured seriousness. "Mr. Mercer," he said slowly, turning his attention back toward me, "the court acknowledges that the authenticity of your decorations is no longer in question." I nodded slightly, but did not speak. General Hayes looked toward the judge again. "If I may add one more detail, Your Honor," he said. The judge gestured lightly for him to continue. The general's eyes returned to the medals resting against my jacket. "Those decorations were not given lightly," he said quietly. Then he looked back toward the bench and spoke the final sentence with calm certainty. "The man standing before you did not just earn them," General Hayes said. "He earned them while saving the lives of the entire unit I was commanding." The courtroom fell completely silent again, and for the first time since the hearing had begun the weight in the room was no longer doubt, but respect. I stood quietly as the last words from General Hayes settled into the room, and the silence that followed felt deeper than any silence that had come before it. The spectators in the gallery no longer shifted in their seats or whispered to one another. They simply watched. The afternoon sunlight that had been slowly moving across the courthouse floor now reached almost to the center aisle. lighting the polished wood in a warm glow that made the entire room feel still and deliberate. Judge Carter remained seated behind the bench, but the posture he carried now was not the same one he had held when the hearing began. Earlier, there had been impatience in his voice and certainty in his authority. Now there was something else. Thoughtfulness. He looked from General Hayes to the small row of medals resting against my jacket, and then finally back to my face. The room waited for him to speak. When he finally did, his voice carried a calm seriousness that had not been there before. "Mr. Mercer," he said slowly, "this court recognizes that the authenticity of your service and the honors you received has been clearly confirmed." I nodded slightly, but said nothing. General Hayes remained standing beside me, his presence steady and quiet, the silver stars on his shoulders catching the late afternoon light. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the bench as though carefully choosing his next words. "It appears," he continued, "that this courtroom has been reminded of something important today." The spectators listened closely. The judge's gaze moved across the gallery briefly before returning to me again. "Sometimes," he said, "the quietest person in the room carries the greatest history." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then the judge straightened fully in his chair. "The court apologizes for questioning the legitimacy of those decorations," he said firmly. The statement echoed across the courtroom with a sincerity that surprised more than a few people in the gallery. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement. General Hayes glanced at me for a brief moment before returning his attention to the bench. Judge Carter then looked toward Emily Rhodes at the clerk's desk. "Ms. Rhodes," he said, "please note for the record that Mr. Mercer's service record has been formally acknowledged and verified." Emily nodded respectfully as she began typing again, the soft clicking of the keyboard sounding much different now than it had earlier in the afternoon. The tension that had once filled the room had dissolved into something quieter. Respect. Judge Carter then looked back toward General Hayes. "General," he said carefully, "the court appreciates your willingness to clarify this matter." General Hayes nodded once. "It was important that the truth be recognized," he replied calmly. The judge paused briefly before adding one final sentence. "And it has been." The room remained silent for another moment before the judge lifted the small wooden gavel resting on the bench. He tapped it lightly once. The sound echoed gently through the courtroom. "This hearing is concluded," he announced. The spectators began rising slowly from their seats, though many of them lingered just long enough to take one last look at the quiet man standing in the center of the room. General Hayes turned slightly toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a small, respectful nod that carried more meaning than words ever could. I returned the gesture just as quietly. As the courtroom slowly emptied and the fading sunlight continued to stretch across the floor, I realized something simple that years of life had taught me many times before. Respect is not something that needs to be demanded. It simply waits for the moment when the truth is finally seen.